So we start the first section that is on access to internet and access to plurality. Okay, we'll have to announce that Professor Frosini wasn't well today, and so she cannot be with us. The paper, however, is available, so will be given. I think we'll see how to give to you. And so, because of the similarity of topic, we invert the order, because Nicola Lucchi was talking exactly on this on close topics to the one Frosini was explaining. So we'll have first Nicola, and then we'll have Don Chillon that will speak, and then we'll have some debate before lunch. Okay, I think we can start with Nicola. The topic, as I said before, is access to internet, access to plurality, and question mark.
So, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here in Florence, and at the UI in particular. In my presentation today, I will try to discuss the unique nature of access to network services and the intrinsic connection with the concept of pluralism. As we obviously know, the internet has become an essential tool for many life-related purposes. and it is now an instrument necessary for the proper enjoyment of a series of rights, including the right to access to knowledge, the right to information, and the right to communicate. This new paradigm also imply that that all the people should have access to the internet at affordable conditions. And any restriction should be strictly limited and fair. As a consequence, any regulatory and policy measure that affect the internet and the content that flow over it should be consistent with the basic human rights and liberties of human beings. During my presentation, I intend to briefly explore the challenges and the opportunities for freedom of speech and human rights on the internet. In particular, my intention is to exemplify how internet content governance is posing some provocative and fascinating regulatory issue directly related to the growing possibilities offered by the computer-mediated communication. And this debate is important not simply because it's a technical debate, but also because it is a political, legal, and social debate, since it involves ethical and value-oriented solution, but also, and more importantly, the consciousness of the human right dimension of internet governance and internet content governance. In particular, I want to describe how the advent of the internet has expanded the possibility for access to content and information, as well as for the exercise of the freedom of communication. The possible answer to this issue are at the center of an ongoing discussion concerning the regulation of digital content and communication technologies. Anyway, before entering in the discussion, I want to start my presentation with some data and information regarding the content, the context within which we are moving. And in particular, when we talk about access, we need to consider that 4.6 billion of people, that is to say more or less the 68% of the world population, are still disconnected from the internet. So when we discuss about access to the internet and the content and in general of digital pluralism, we need to consider that for a full enjoyment of the use of the internet, we also require active public measure to guarantee a full level of connectivity. So these important numbers make clear that the fight for internet freedom and for a real and effective access to the internet is not limited to digital reforms recently discussed or introduced in Europe and in the US. Here in this slide you have a list of the most known piece of legislation that were discussed on both sides of the Atlantic. And from this point of view, it's also interesting to observe how this piece of legislation demonstrates how governments are increasingly reaffirming their self-determining rights, enforcing domestic policy on the internet. That, as you know, I mean, is a nonsense. On this ground, it's however important also to remember that, historically speaking, governments have always attempted to control the flow of information. From the sentencing of Socrates to the medieval control on the invention of the printing press, up to the contemporary restriction on access to the internet. So a number of governments react to the development of the internet in much the same way they reacted to the broadcasting in the mid-20th century, that is to say with the state control. So the current interference with the freedom of emerging technologies is not something of new. It's therefore evident, at least to me, that the question of access is still the most pressing issue we are facing today. In this sense, and from this point of view, it seems evident that the internet is not actually the solution to the pluralism, but probably is part of the problem. The debate around the fundamental role of internet and other information and communication technologies for the contemporary society intensified during the last few years. And first was probably the BBC survey in 2010. According to this poll, nearly 80% of people in 26 countries believe that access to the World Wide Web should be considered a basic human right. So apart from the real legal perspective, because I mean we can distinguish between the impression and the reality, the citizen perception of the value of the internet access is very strong. And also this poll demonstrated that most users feel that the internet should not be regulated directly by governments. After this first sign, in May 2011, you probably know that the UN Special Rapporteur, Frank Leroux, presented his report on freedom of expression and the internet to the Human Rights Council. Since that, the human rights dimension of internet governance was discussed in a much wider context than ever before. And in all the recent discussion, one of the most common consensus is that in the first 1 century, access to the internet and the free use of all these services is a sort of fundamental instrument for the enjoyment of freedom of expression. This is now reflected in a growing number of documents and international instruments adopted by the United Nations and also by other intergovernmental bodies. Immediately after the report of 2011, in July 2012, the Human Rights Council adopted a new resolution on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. And specifically, the most significant part of this resolution states that the same right that people have offline must be protected online, in particular freedom of expression, which is applicable regardless of boundaries and through any media of any choice. And the resolution also makes an invitation to the states to promote and facilitate access to the internet and international cooperation addressed at the development of media and information pluralism. There is therefore a growing consensus that the internet constitutes a value in itself. In particular, in today's society, the basic human right of freedom of expression and information cannot be properly exercised without the presence of a large number of competing media outlets, and which are free from the domination of political and commercial interests. Access to a large variety of media is not just necessary for free speech, it is also essential to make democracy effective. In particular, in the digital context, it seems more and more evident that the right to free expression and the free flow of information and the notion also of pluralism must be supplemented by a new element that is a sort of right to connect. In this direction can be seen not only the already cited documents of the United Nations, but also some other documents, such as the one that you have in the second part of the slide. The decision of the French Constitutional Court on evaluating the constitutionality of the adopted law in France, affirming that the freedom of expression implies also the freedom to access to electronic communication networks, as well as the decision of the Supreme Court of Costa Rica, affirming that access to the internet technology is a basic tool to facilitate the exercise of fundamental rights and democratic participation. The more recent decision of the Federal Supreme Court of Germany, in which it has been recognized the essential value of the right of the individual to access the internet, as well as the Greek Constitution that explicitly provide a positive obligation to guarantee connectivity. Anyway, probably is now necessary to try to explain what does it mean to have an access, to have the access to the internet. From a very simplistic point of view, we can describe, or we can try to answer to this question, saying that this access means to have the ability to participate in society online. Internet has in fact the concrete potential to be a place that value personal information, personal freedom and individual rights. A place where people can express and share their view in a much less with much less chance and risk of being excluded for what they say or what they do. In particular, because a full range of human activities is now strictly and naturally connected with online services. From finding and applying for a job, doing research and completing education, taking part in social communication, participating in politics, finding legislative information, and so on. It's therefore clear and evident that access to the network services is becoming a fundamental instrument for democratization in public life, and as well as to be able to have an active role in the society. Probably is also necessary to point out that having access is also an economic opportunity, because access not only connect people to opportunities, but also create opportunities. On the other hand, from a more practical and applied perspective, the concept of access to the internet may be described in several ways. As access to the network infrastructure, access to the transport and the transport level and the service level, and access to the digital content and application. So more or less we can distinguish between two main dimensions, access to the content and access to the connectivity. Anyway, so the content and the infrastructure dimension are essentially interconnected. It means that there is no content without connectivity. And as was already observed also in the report of the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, both aspects, content and connectivity, are able to pose distinct but interrelated fundamental right challenges. Content relates to the availability of information for users, and so restricting access to content can seriously damage the freedom of users. On the other hand, on the other side, connectivity directly relates to the infrastructure necessary to access the content, such cable, software, and devices. And from this perspective, the availability of this infrastructure essentially deals with the provision of telecommunication services. The next question is about the codification of the access to the internet. And here, I mean, probably we can face some of the most troublesome discussion. We can codify the access to the internet considering two dimensions. The two dimensions of content and connectivity under two different perspectives. From the human right dimension, or under the human right dimension, we can say that freedom of expression can protect both content and connectivity against any kind of unjustified restriction. Content, that is to say, more or less information, is obviously protected by freedom of expression. But at the same time, freedom of expression also safeguard, or it's able to safeguard the instrument by which expression or content is communicated. On this same level, there is also a growing movement that asks to make internet access a fundamental right in itself. That is to say, more or less, a specific right to protect the internet and the universal access to it. An explicit right of individual to access the network infrastructure. This is a position that is quite debated, but is essentially supported by human rights activists, digital rights advocates, and also by some legal scholars. I think that more realistically, access to the internet and freedom of expression online are simply contemporary technological manifestation of the existing human rights of freedom of expression. From a different perspective, and in particular under the civil rights dimension, access to broadband internet can be seen also as a universal service. Similar, to the other public utilities like telephone service, water supply, and electricity. It means especially to consider the internet as a staple commodity to which every consumer and company must have access. In this way, the right can be enforceable and obviously established by secondary legislation. This approach, in particular, is already followed by some European countries. So, we have a real experience on this point of view. Estonia, Finland, and Spain have in fact included a broadband internet access in the universal service obligation. We know that the Universal Service Directive, as amended in 2009, does not include broadband access within the universal service obligation. So, this piece of legislation, makes something more than the content required by the directive. So here the question, obviously, is whether to redefine the concept of universal service to include such services as well. Just to make some concluding remarks and also some policy recommendation, we can say that in order to be in line with the international human rights frameworks, it would be necessary to clearly determine and legally define the scope, objective, and limitation for controlling online content, as well as the access to the medium. That is to say, harmonizing the current regulatory regime. In particular, all policy should be transparent, proportional, and fairly applied, and regulated possibly by independent and impartial judicial institutions. Concerning some policy proposal in this framework, we can include measures to focus all restriction on content and connectivity, so on content and access, on clear, specific, and fair rules. Again, make explicit the limit on delegated authority and on measures that could lead to arbitrary control, form of control. Again, increase transparency over any form of internet blocking, and apply principle of due process in respect of any form of internet control. And this is, I think, is particularly important when the control is delegated to intermediaries. And finally, and not for this, less important, also consider the possibility to include measure to complement the right to free expression and the notion of pluralism with a sort of new principle, that is to say, a right to connect, but in the sense of a sort of enlargement of the right to free expression. So something that is already well defined in the human rights instruments, so not something of new in this respect. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I think we may listen to both presentations and then we may open the floor, okay? So, floor goes to